I've just had 4 days working, so this is my rest day. So I've just come out in the garden to have a look around, and just gutted. Look at my borage. It's absolutely covered in powdery mildew. It's everywhere. So I'm going to have to take that out, because right next to it is all my peas, and they are really susceptible to that. So yeah, it's a shame. Look at all the flower heads that are coming. Such a pity, but that's got to come out. I've just topped up all the potato bags, pots, because the leaves were coming through, but they were only half filled. So they're all topped up. The Christmas potatoes that I sowed last year, they're mostly up. These ones had shoots, so they should be poking through soon. I'm pleased with that. Peas are coming along nicely. They've put on quite a lot of growth. And the soil's had a good soak in, and I've just sprayed the peas to try and prevent powdery mildew. Let's quickly show you what I've used. It's organic, and it's not that I'm advertising at all, but this is what I'm using to spray my sweet peas and my calendula, and I will also do that to the courgettes when they go in, just to try and help prevent the powdery mildew. So yesterday I planted up my salad bar. So I've got all mixed lettuce down the bottom, Laura Rossa there. These are my coriander plants that I split. This one's just loving it. There's another one down here. Some more salad, and then in here I've sown some radishes. It's absolutely romping away. At least 4 foot tall now, and so far not much in the way of black fly, and I'm putting that down to the fact that it's in the same bed as my bird feeder, so I'm hoping that the sparrows are having all those. So far so good. Last year was an absolute disaster, so I'm keeping my fingers crossed this year. Hi everyone, back in the garden, back in the summer house, and trying to stay warm. It's actually really cold today. It was only a few days ago that we had temperatures of 25 degrees, particularly on VE day. It was absolutely beautiful and there was very little breeze. Really enjoyable day, and yet 3 days later I think the outside temperature is about 10 degrees. So yeah, it feels very different today, and I'm sure you can hear the wind blustering at the moment. Paddy's at my feet. We're a lot warmer sitting in the summer house with the door shut. Anyway, in my last video I mentioned that I was open to suggestions of how you would like some of the content, if you had any ideas, because I didn't want it to get too repetitive. By that I mean, being such a small garden, I'm limited in what I can grow, and if I'm doing regular videos then they're going to start repeating themselves if I'm not careful. So I think it was Nancy, who is also known as Flower May, suggested that if I would like to talk about perhaps my roots, where I got my love and passion of gardening from, and anything else that I might like to sort of talk about. So I have given it some thought. So I thought I'd start off by saying that I grew up in Kent. My roots are in Kent. My maternal side of the family are from Sandwich, near Deal and Dover. My paternal side of the family is mostly from Tunbridge Wells, although there are roots there that actually go back to Frome in Somerset, and to a little place called Witham Friary, which I've never been to, but one day perhaps I will. So there's been some migration over the years, with great grandparents and great grandparents migrating towards London looking for work, and that's very true for both sets of grandparents. My mother's family, their parents moved up to South London, mainly around Clerkenwell, Lambeth, I think Nunhead, that kind of area. My father's side of the family moved up from Tunbridge Wells, or a place called Rust Hall, which is a village in the Tunbridge Wells area. They moved up to sort of Sydenham Penge area, and then during the war my parents met. So that's basically my background. I was born in the late 50s, and my parents, having saved for about 7 years I think, managed a deposit on a little bungalow in Orpington, and that's where I grew up. Now my dad, he loved his garden, and so did his mother, and I've since learned that his dad, my granddad Pop, had an allotment between the wars, and that my grandmother did most of the gardening at home, and I think that rubbed off on my dad. So the kind of planting my dad did when I was a child was very, not necessarily formal, but they were quite habitual in the way that they planted. He always did his borders the same every year. They were mostly bedding plants. There would be a lot of Elysium, snapdragons, salvia, marigolds. I particularly remember the French marigolds because of the smell and unfortunately the taste, because when you're a child you always pick stuff and then you put it in your mouth. So I remember playing with the flowers, and then of course when you touch your mouth and your hands, got a horrible taste. So whenever I smell marigolds I always remember that. What else did he grow? We had lots of daffodils which he used to lift at the end of every spring. He used to dry them out on trays in his shed and then plant them again late autumn. So he was he did everything with a kind of structured habit. Later on, as I got older and we moved to a bigger house with a bigger garden, he had a small veggie patch in the back garden. But I don't remember him being very experimental. I remember that he always grew potatoes and runner beans, and I sit here trying to think what else did he grow, and I can't remember anything else at all. I think it was just literally runner beans and potatoes. And then in my very late teens, early 20s, I got my first little flat. I moved into Swanley. Didn't have a garden, missed that terribly, and so started collecting houseplants. And I'd been to Holland a couple of times, and I don't know if you've been to Holland, but I don't know if they still do it, but it seemed to be quite a tradition over there. Most of their windows, they'd have half lace nets from the top of the window frame to the middle, and then the bottom half of the window would be really dramatic displays of pot plants, and that stuck in my mind, and when coming back to England I would try and replicate that, and so that was my first venture into nurturing plants. I then bought a house in Swanley which had a proper garden. It had very low, like chicken wire type link fencing, which was very exposed to everybody else. But over time I started experimenting, firstly with just bedding plants, because I think that was the only experience I had, but then putting a 6-foot fence to give more privacy. And I remember planting a small apple tree. I remember starting to try shrubs and other perennials, and it kind of grew from there. So that's my start into gardening. In the late 80s, due to circumstances, I then moved from Swanley and bought a little house in Eltham in South London, and that had a fabulous garden. It had a well-stocked pond with a rock garden around it. It had a nice shed and a greenhouse, and it had quite a large space for a veggie plot, a good 50% of the garden in fact, and I did manage to grow a few things. I really enjoyed that, so I think that was probably my first taste of growing vegetables. I grew some carrots, I grew potatoes, I grew my runner beans. Again, quite a basic selection, but it was a learning curve, and it had really been based on everything that I'd seen my dad do, so it wasn't very experimental. And then I think we got to about early 90s. I was now married, and I had my first son. He was about 16 months old at the time, and we moved up to a place called Kennet, which was on the Cambridgeshire and Suffolk borders, and that was a really rural place, beautiful old cottage with a 90-foot garden, a huge lime tree. It had a good sized veggie patch which was overgrown at the time, and a 30-foot driveway behind that took you out into open fields. So amazingly different to everything else that I'd known. The actual garden itself was really beautifully maintained cottage garden with plants that even now I don't know the names of, but I would recognise if I saw them. I know there was a massive patch of goldenrod. There were hollyhocks everywhere, some of them 15, 16 feet tall, various different colours, calendula. Do you know, I really can't remember all the different perennials that were there, but it was a fantastic garden, and I absolutely adored looking after it. It was a lot of work. In fact, my front garden, which had a huge privet hedge, the front garden was bigger than any garden I'd owned before. So, you know, there was a lot to look after. And then I think I was there for about 9 years, and then through divorce I came with my 2 boys to Soham. We came to a very traditional 1990s style estate, housing estate, postage stamp size back garden, nothing remarkable. It was surrounded by leylandii hedge, which eventually removed. That was 17 trees that we had to remove, and that was cool. That was hard work. We put up fencing all around, and it was just a typical garden. I started to create flower beds around the edges. I put in a plum tree. What else did we do? Really, because the boys were quite young by then. I think my eldest was about 10 when we moved in. The youngest 6 going on 7, and so they needed somewhere to play, so I still had a lawn. And then I think it was about 6 or 7 years ago, I had the opportunity of taking on half of a friend's allotment, which was absolutely fabulous. I loved every minute of it, but it was surrounded by other plots that were abandoned and overgrown, so it was a real challenge to try and keep it clean all the time. It had a lot of creeping buttercup, it had a lot of couch grass, and my first year was pretty successful, but with increasing work hours and various other issues, I was studying with the OU and working full time. It just became really difficult, and also I didn't have a shed on the plot, and some people were having their plots broken into, some were having their crops stolen, and I just got so fed up one day, and I thought to myself, that's it, I'm bringing my allotment home. And that's exactly what I did, and that's where I am today. But I will also mention that when I started these videos, I think it was in July last year, I'd also begun a blog, but I just don't get the time to write the blogs anymore, and film and work the garden and work full time and have a little bit of time for myself. So I'll put the link for that below. You can have a quick look, and it's got some pictures on there too. But I think I've rambled enough for now, so I'm going to go make another cup of coffee. So take care, everyone.